Okay, our next speaker is Paul Mushrush, and Paul has a story to tell you that you haven't heard. It involves a part of World War II, which most people aren't familiar with. Paul was involved in what was known as the Lend-Lease program during the Second World War. Now, it was a program that provided the Soviet Union with resources when their country was in dire straits. You remember Germany invaded Russia. At one point early on, Russia was in dire straits and needed help. We supplied that. They established what was known as the Persian Corridor, and it was a supply route through Iran into the Soviet Union, and Lend-Lease supplies were transferred through that. And the delivery of these war materials was very critical to the Soviet Union and their survival. And when they set up the route through Iran, they established a railroad. The Army established a railroad. They sent personnel over there, military force, technical teams, to run the supply route. And they actually sent 5 million tons of munition and other war supplies to the Soviet Union. And Paul was part of this program. As I say, it's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So Paul's going to relate to you his experiences. And it's my honor and privilege to present Paul Mushrush. He's 94 years young, still golfing and still boating. So, Paul.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I was drafted. I worked on the railroad in Meadville, on the Erie Railroad, the firemen and steam engines. And they drafted me and sent me to Iran to run work trains on that railroad and maintain it so they could run these supplies to Russia. That was my job. And we went over there in a Liberty ship, little bit of a Liberty ship, and we was in an 18-ship convoy going across the Atlantic. And when we got to the Mediterranean Sea, the convoy went north to Normandy in England, and we went by ourselves into the Mediterranean Sea. And we couldn't use the Mediterranean Sea for regular transportation because it was full of German submarines. And it was very dangerous to get through that there, but they needed us so bad in Iran that they thought that would better take the shortest route. Well, that shortest route turned into 32 days on that ship. It was terrible. We could only travel during the daylight time, and we had airplanes circling overhead watching for subs. At night, everything was shut down. We sat still all night. No motors, no noises, no lights, no nothing. Every night. Well, this one night, there was a German sub in the area, and he torpedoed us, and it missed us. It went by us. They see it going by. They see the wake of this torpedo going by. And they must not have had any more because we waited all night for the second one and it never happened. Oh, well, anyway, we finally made it through the Mediterranean, down through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean and up into the Persian Gulf with our little ship. They had to use little ships because the Persian Gulf and these here ports there and ports at the deep where we had to disembark was shallow, and they couldn't go in there with big ships. And it's the same way sending the supplies over there in these same ships, Liberty ships, had to be small to get into the ports. So the Liberty ships, it was made by made in California by Kaiser Fraser made them. And they made 2,700 of them. They mass-produced them. And they needed them because that's what they used mainly to supply Russia with what they needed to fight with. And we, in the United States, made supplies for these here, for the Russians, the same as they made the supplies for the Americans in Europe. The same tanks and the same ammunition, the same big guns and everything. Everything they got in Europe, we sent to Russia, the same things. And airplanes, we even sent airplanes over there, and we had a battalion of Air Force men down at the Abadan, at one of the ports in Iran. We had a whole battalion of Air Force men down there to assemble the planes, come off these little ships, all in crates. They had to put them together down there and test fly them. And then they had to teach the Russian pilots how to fly our airplanes. Then they flew them to Tehran, and from there on to the Caspian Sea and on to the war. And with all the ammunitions and all the bombs and all the food and everything that they needed to fight with. It was a really monumental thing to see that railroad. But that railroad was nothing but more than a tuna rail trolley when we got over there. It was a wreck. 15-mile-an-hour speed. It was terrible. So our men completely rebuilt that railroad from one end to the other. And it was over 900 miles from the Persian Gulf to Tehran. And they wasn't straight, easy miles, because it went from below sea level at the Persian Gulf to over 9,000 feet going through Iran to get to Tehran. It was really a tough railroad. And on top of all that, we had 135 tunnels in that railroad through the mountains. And everything had to be small enough to get through these tunnels. Nothing was easy. So that's why the airplanes had to be all taken off and fly and put the wings on one thing and another at the port of entry, and then flew up to Tehran. We sent bombers and fighter planes, and all the equipment to go with them. Army tanks, big guns, everything. And it was my job to try to keep that railroad together, repaired. A small part of my railroad was between 200 to 300 miles down out of the desert into the mountains. Okay, we've running so many trains up into Russia after that railroad got so we could use it. Before we got it, the railroad so we could use it, the British wanted to maintain the railroad. The British wanted to, the Americans wanted to, Indians from India, they wanted to, and the Iranians wanted to run it, and everybody was trying to put it together so we could use it, and it was just mass confusion. Nothing was getting done. Everybody had different ideas. So the United States told them, we'll run the railroad and everybody else get out. So then it started working, and it worked good. We run trains like bananas up there after we got things going. The United States sent 125 brand new diesel electric engines over there, 125 of them, to handle all this here heavy freight. And the engines had to be small enough to get through these tunnels. So it had limits to how big they could be. But anyway, eventually it worked. And the Russians got what they needed. Also, we sent them tank car after tank car of fuel oil, high-test gasoline for the airplanes, and to run all the machinery that they had up there in Russia. And we also sent them tank cars after tank cars of diesel fuel, everything they needed. And Iran had lots of them. They had a good supply. from the Iranian oil fields. So that part was all right. But I was stationed at Alwas, and they built a huge shops there in Alwas to build railroad cars for the railroad, because the cars that they had was, most of them didn't have any air brakes on them or anything. They were just on the rail trolley, like I said. So they had this huge shop at Alwas to build new cars and to maintain all the rolling stock on the railroad. And that was quite an undertaking. So when I wasn't working on the work trains to maintain the railroad to whatever they needed, that shop used acetylene welding on building all these cars and everything. A lot of welding, but they didn't have no way of getting their oxygen. For the oxygen, they could get the acetylene, but no oxygen. But the British had an oxygen plant in Iraq, in Basra. So about once a month, that was another one of my jobs, is to go to Basra with a big truckload of empty oxygen tanks and go across the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and over into Basra to the oxygen plant. And they filled them tanks one at a time. It took all day for them to fill a truckload of oxygen. But that was all right, because when you crossed the Tigris and Euphrates River, that was a big, long bridge. In the middle of that bridge, 8 o'clock every morning, dropped to the bottom of the rivers. So the ships could go up and down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to Baghdad. And just before dark at night, they'd raise that bridge back up. It was all on big cables, and they'd raise it back up there so the road traffic could go. So that was all right if it took all day to fill the oxygen tanks, because I couldn't go back anyway. But anyway, it all worked out, and one time I went over there, and it was in the monsoon season. Everything was so hot and so wet, it was just dripping. The weather was terrible. Well, that's the season that the dates ripen over there, and everybody had dates for sale, all these Iraqi people. So I bought about 3 pounds of them. They was wrapped in cellophane, about the size of a pound of butter. And I had a man ride with me because we had to go through Arab country. And I had a man ride through with me. It was my shotgun man, for protection. I had my rifle, and he had a shotgun. And we was on our way home, and of course it was dark then. And my shotgun man says to me, he says, "You know, Paul," he says, "I'm getting hungry. Why don't we try a few of them dates?" I said, "Well, that's a good idea." And I gave him my knife. I said, "Just slice off a couple slices of them." So he did, and he said, "Well, those are good. We eat probably half a pound of them." Well, anyway, when we got back to camp, back to Alwas with the oxygen, we took them to the shops where they was waiting on them, and then went back to the barracks. And the next morning, we had mud brick barracks we lived in. And anyway, I got up the next morning. The rest of the guys in the barracks says, "Well, how'd the trip go to Basra?" I says, "Oh, same as ever." But I said, we got some dates. Oh boy, they all wanted to try them. So we got the dates out and cut them off, some pieces, full of maggots. Full of maggots, white maggots. We eat a whole mess of them. That awful. Funny things like that happen. So I made up my mind right there, and no, never buy any imported dates. Boy, what a world. Well, anyway, As the war was raging in Europe, you all know about the European War and the Battle of the Bulge and all that stuff. While that was going hot licks, the Germans took whatever countries they wanted to with very little resistance. None of those other countries was prepared to fight the German army. And the German armies was something else. They was wonderful armies. And they had everything they needed to fight with. And they knew how to use them. So there's nothing that Europe could do when Germany come through there but they just give up. The Germans just took everything they wanted. Okay, while the battles were raging in Europe, it was still, the Germans decided to move into Russia. So they did, and they got to Leningrad, and they leveled the city. They bombed it and leveled the city and killed them Russians by the thousands. And they was on their way to Moscow. They was going to take the whole country. And we got that supply route going up through Iran and supplied the Russians with everything that they needed to fight with. And I mean everything: food, clothing, ammunition, guns, trucks by the thousands we sent up there, because our armies are no good unless they can be moved. Yeah, they got to be able to move and go where they need to, and they got to have these trucks to move their equipment and their war equipment. And so we sent them trucks by the thousands. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, that turned the tide of the war in Russia. They turned the Germans around, and at the same time we was having a big battle of the Bulge in Europe, we drove the Germans back into Berlin. The Russians drove them on their side, out of Russia, clear across Europe and back into Berlin. And that was the end of the war. And I don't suppose any of you ever heard about that story. But what would have happened in World War II if we hadn't supplied the Russians with what they needed and run that supply route through Russia or through Iran? That was an awful tough situation we had there. And not only that, that railroad had no communications. And you can't run trains in both directions on a single track without communications. No, especially through them mountains. And it's terrible terrain we had to run through. So we had to wire that entire railroad, over 900 miles of copper wire, to communicate before we could start running the trains. It was terrible. We run by train orders until we got the wires up. But the natives over there, Iranians, it wasn't over very many days, and they was stealing the wire. They'd cut down a couple miles of wire and melt it over. At night they'd do this. So another part of my job is replacing all these wires on that work train. So I was pretty busy all the time doing something like that. They used me wherever they needed me. They even had me as a station master at the depot at Awas, because that was the British's job, but half the time the British wouldn't show up. Yeah, and so that was my job, was a station master. And I had to take care of all the freight that come in and out of that there station there for the whole day. And we had a passenger train. One of them would go north one day and come south the next day. And all that there freight, it was personal freight and whatever they needed to ship by passenger train. It was my job to keep account of all that stuff and get it loaded and unloaded. And I had 3 natives that worked for me over there, and it was wonderful. And we got the job done. Then the next day I'd be back on the work train. And then once a month I took a break and went to Basra. So I was going all the time. That was Sunday when I used to go to Basra. I broke down one time with a truck, gas line broke on it, going across the desert, going to Basra. I was going as fast as I could go because I had to get there before they dropped that bridge down the bottom of the river. So I had to get over there before they done that. So I was going fast as I could across the desert, and a gas line broke. I didn't know what happened, but I was driving in an open cab truck, and I smelled gasoline. I looked down the floor, it was all wet with gas. So I stopped as quick as I could, and my shotgun man, he went one way and I went the other. And we waited till the fumes stopped, and I was waiting for a big explosion, but it didn't happen. So I come back and I found the gas line was broke where it went right into the carburetor, broke clear off. So I'm standing there looking at it there, wondering what I'm going to do with it. No tools, no nothing. I had a jack for changing tires, that's all. And I'm looking at it, wondering what I'm going to do, clear out in the middle of the desert. And I heard some shuffling around behind me, and I turned around and looked, and there were 3 or 4 camels with Arabs on them, with rifles, coming in behind me. And boy, if I'd been by myself, I'd been gone. But I had a man with a shotgun, and they'd leave you alone if you had got some help. So anyway, I got this one camel, the guy got off his camel, this Arab, and I just showed him what I needed. I needed something I could go like that there, and I showed him where it was, and then I needed a screwdriver. I go like that there, I couldn't talk to him, you know. And so they looked at it, and they listened to me there, and got on their camels, and away they went. And I said, well, now what are we going to do? We can't change that there gas line with a jack. Is all we had of tools. About 15 or 20 minutes later, back comes these Arabs with a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. Huh? Ain't that something? And I fixed that gas line, believe it or not. It had to be reflanged and everything, and the broken part taken out, and I done everything with that screwdriver and a pair of pliers. And I had to do something. I put it back together there and tightened everything up the best I could, and never leaked a drop. And away I went, and I got to Basra before they dropped the bridge. Well, we had so many funny things over there. It wasn't all funny then, but that's the way we operated. Okay, now, when the Russians got the Germans out of Russia, and we got the Battle of the Bulge over with, the train stopped, everything stopped. That's the end, because the war is over. So what are they going to do with all us guys now and all this equipment we got? They had it in the records, in the books, for us to go across to Afghanistan, over the Burma Road, it was just opened up, northern in the Himalaya Mountains in India, into eastern China, and to fight the Japs. And we was going to go over there and by trucks, convoys. And that was all in the schedules. So they had to get these trucks all loaded up with this equipment that Russia didn't need anymore, and going east with it. And one convoy had already left. And then they dropped a bomb in Japan. And that stopped that, and that stopped our going over the Burma Road. I wanted to see that Burma Road. I wasn't ready to go home. I was ready to fight some more. Well, anyway, that was the end of the war, and I don't know what would have happened in World War II if we hadn't done our job over there in Iran and that supply route to Russia. And that's about all I can tell you. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Those maggots she ate, did you continue that diet, or did you give them up?
It didn't make me sick.
95 years old?
It made me sick to think about it.
Good job.
Yeah, anybody more, got any questions?
Well, I watched you run an engine for years, and I can't imagine you doing 15 miles an hour. It was always wide open every time I rode.
You're right. Yeah. Well, this engine I had to work on over there was an old broken down steam engine. It must have been 100 years old, because they didn't want any of the good power used on work trains. So that's what I was on, and didn't have no air compressor on it, and didn't have no generator for electric, no headlights, no nothing.
Well, they knew that's the only way they could slow you down.
Good job.
I had a conductor work with me. He says, these old engines won't go very fast, Paul. You can run them as fast as they'll go. So I'm coming